Ready? Okay. Well, first I just want to also thank all of you for coming, in that this is an unrehearsed, impromptu, kind of informal night where I have to learn how to let people be nice to me and to help me. So I took care of my dad, I took care of my mom, I took care of everything. So this is actually sort of my beginning of my Shiva period. So, matter of fact, the day before my father got ill, I saw Rabbi Kleinbaum at the door coming in at shul, and I said to her, like, what happens if my father gets ill when you're on sabbatical? And she goes, poo. He'll be fine, whatever, but if not, you could use Bethune Street for shloshim. So I said, oh. So what I'm doing tonight is, one, I do want to tell the stories of my dad. And my dad was actually here right in this space in November of 1990 when we started Lesbian and Gay Children of Holocaust Survivors. I needed some sort of keynote person to start off our first Kristallnacht program. So my dad did come, and he got up, and he started 3 minutes, and started crying, and sat down and said, Riki, you finish it. So today, I'm going to be doing all of those stories, and again, one of the disclaimers, you're allowed to laugh, and also I'm allowed to cry, because somehow I try to get through this, and at the United Nations, the only reason my speech was so much different than everyone else's is that when the picture of my dad went up behind me, I cracked up crying. And everyone then got quiet, even the people from Uganda, Indonesia, because it's still real to me. So that is why this is part of Shloshim. This is a night to spend getting to know my dad and also allowing everyone to comfort me. And also, in 2007, CBST had these recession breakfasts for people who lost their job. I wasn't laid off or fired, but I decided to take early retirement to spend more time with my parents, because I began realizing my dad's number one thing was to be independent. The only way he could be independent if somebody behind the scenes was helping him to be independent. And I decided, fine, I will take the time off. And I thought in a few years I'd go back to work. And instead I really have been enjoying this time period of spending so much time with my parents and also volunteering in so many places. But I said, I want to change my career. I want to leave being a lawyer, a professor, an engineer, and go into something else where I use my life and to do walking tours or speaking. And then finally, I didn't even know the word storytelling. So at one of the events that I was going at, someone said, you're a really good storyteller. So I put on my website that, I'm doing storytelling instead of being a lawyer or a professor. And then everyone said, no, you got it backwards. You've always been a storyteller. You've just been performing as a lawyer or as a professor. And then I realized that's where I get it from, is from my dad. My dad was an excellent storyteller, and spent his whole life making people laugh. So, let's see. I'll start it off first with the background history, because everyone heard the story, and my dad was he was invited to Dachau this April to speak at the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau, because my dad was an inmate at 18, right after Kristallnacht, and he was also an American soldier when they liberated Dachau. So I will now spend a little bit of time on that whole story. But when my father got the invitation to come to Dachau, he was very excited. He goes, Ricky, look here, I got an invitation to go back to Dachau. He goes, I hope the food is better. so it's sort of like other people get invited to go to Disneyland. I get invited to go to Dachau. But it's my third time. He goes, I wonder if they're going to give me clothes. I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, the first time they gave me blue and white. The second time they gave me a green army uniform. So if I go back there, they better give me a suit. So I did contact them, and I said that my dad was still alive, but that it was probably too much for him to fly over there, and we were going to do something on Skype. So I don't know if we can I don't think Skype has an app for that now. So I will probably write something and send it to Dachau. But how that story starts, and I'll go all the way back. Remember Fiddler on the Roof when all the Jews were leaving Anatevka? And many of your families picked up at that point in time and came to America. Well, that side of my family, Gershon and Sophie Landman, were able to get a visa to go to Munich. Gershon Landman was from Husiaten and was a very well-known Hasidic Talmudic scholar, my great-grandfather. And as a result, he got permission to go to Munich. So the area that is now the gay neighborhood was the Orthodox Ostjuden Jewish neighborhood of Munich. And there's a rainbow flag on the building where my grandparents were first deported to the Judenhaus and then to Theresienstadt where they died. But they were at the eastern part of Galicia. The area where now is Ukraine, but during the last century, Poland and Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia, and for some reason that I don't know, but I wouldn't have been here if it didn't happen, Sophie and Gershon had 5 children. 4 of them were born on the western side of the Zerbruch River. And my grandpa Joseph, for some reason, was born on the eastern side of the Zerbruch River. And his birth certificate was in Russian, when the other people's birth certificates were in Polish. Of course, growing up didn't really matter. When my grandfather Joseph was 2 years old, they moved to Munich, and the family grew up in Munich. Joseph was naturalized and became a German citizen. Gershon and Sophie, I don't think ever did. They never learned German, they just spoke Yiddish. All they did was daven. And they took in boarders to make money, so that if a Polish Hasidic family was going through Germany and needed a place to stay, they would stay with my great-grandparents. So then Joseph grows up in Munich as a typical German person, gets married to Regina, my grandmother, who was a rural German. Her father was a shochet. They lived in an area with cows in rural Germany, but for hundreds of years they were German. So Regina and Joseph get married and move to Augsburg, Germany, which is an hour or so away from Munich. And there they give birth to 3 children, my father Henry and his 2 sisters Irma and Joan. And my dad is born in 1920. So the first 13 years of his life, he's in the Weimar Republic, where Jews had more rights than American Jews, where most of the Jews of my grandparents' generation fought in World War I. My mother's father fought in World War I and was stationed from Nuremberg so he can get kosher food. So it was a different world. Germany, the government built all those synagogues that were burnt on Kristallnacht, were built by the German government through taxes. And Germany had started the Reform movement and the Modern Orthodox movement. And in the Weimar Republic, it was very similar to how I view myself. Are you an American, or are you a Jew, or are you both? German Jews were not, and this is the conversation I have with Shep Wanon all the time, it was different being a German Jew than, say, a Polish Jew, a Russian Jew, a Ukrainian Jew, because in those other countries, you were a Jew who happened to be living in Russia. But in Germany, you were a German citizen who was also Jewish. But of course, at the year of my father's bar mitzvah at 13, that all changed, and the Nazis came to power. And by 1935, my father remembered his father crying. And that was when the Nuremberg Law got passed, because my grandfather fought so hard to become naturalized, to become a German citizen, and in 1935 they lost their citizenship. And then comes 36 and 37, my father's thrown out of school, and my grandfather, because he was not German-born, because he did not serve in World War I, he was a Zionist, he was an Ostjude. That's the type of Jew they put as the president of the Jewish community. If you fought in World War I and you were a big macha, you couldn't be the president of the Jewish community. But if you were a Zionist and you believed that you should move to Palestine and get out of Germany, you became. So my grandfather was the president of the Jewish community from Augsburg and in charge of like the Sportsplatz, which was like a tennis and track and field. So my father, and I know when you look at me and you all know me, it seems so different, but Daddy was a very good athlete. There are all these awards and medals and trophies that I've been giving to the different museums in high jumping and track and field and tennis, which is why Dad lived till 94 and a half. The tennis racket is still in the trunk of the car. I'm going to sell it, I think, with the tennis racket comes included. Daddy played tennis. My father played tennis until he was 93. Wow. And because as a kid, there was nothing else you could do. You didn't go to school anymore. The Jews stayed together and they really bonded and they really did all their athletic stuff together. Except my dad also, and my brother, so I have the gene in me too, has blue eyes. My father also had light-colored hair. So during 35, 36, 37, and 38, he did things that he shouldn't have done. He played soccer with non-Jews. He went skiing with Rudolf Hess. Not that they went together, but they were both skiing down a slope, and the clouds came in, and you had to stay together. And my father standing next to Rudolf Hess. So luckily they didn't have to go to the bathroom, and there was no way of checking that my father was Jewish. But my father really, with blonde hair and blue eyes, didn't really look to the Nazi ideology of this Aryan nation kind of concept to be Jewish, which actually helped him from times to be able to do things. So now comes 38 and Kristallnacht. So my father's family lives on Halderstrasse, which is right near where the synagogue is in Augsburg. And Augsburg has a beautiful, big, domed marble synagogue of about 1,000 seats. So my father was woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning, not with the banging on the door from the Gestapo, doorbell, bzzz, and his aunt, Minna Wolf, answers the door, and they just go like, Heinz Landman. Didn't mention my grandfather's name. And she points, and they go, and they wake him up at 5 in the morning. He puts on his lederhosen. It's November, but that's what they wore, with socks and a sweater. And then they said to him, say goodbye to your mother, and that's it. No other words were basically spoken. So then 2 Gestapo agents on either side walk him to the police precinct, and as he walks by, he sees they're watering down the buildings next to the synagogue while they're burning the synagogue, because they didn't want the non-Jewish buildings to have any damage. So my father at first was wondering, oh, maybe I kissed a Gentile girl, and that's why. He had no idea at first why at 18 years old they're waking him up and bringing him to prison. Well, at about 8:30, my grandfather, Joseph, he also doesn't know why the hell did they arrest his son. He wasn't arrested. So he goes to his attorney, Leopold Riese, and says, let's get Henry out of jail. So Leopold Riese, who fought in World War I, and my grandfather, who is the president of the Jewish community, are walking to the police precinct when all of a sudden a Jew yells out, Joseph, run! They're picking up all the Jews. So a Gestapo agent who didn't have their names on the list said to my grandfather, you Jewish? He said, yes. He said, well, then you better come with me. So I shouldn't be moving. So Joseph then goes to the police station and is with my father. Leopold Riese says, what is this? And they said, we're arresting all male Jews, 18 years and older, but in typical German fashion, they had all these exemptions. And if you fought in World War I, you were exempt. You didn't go to Dachau. So he says, I fought in World War I, I'm an attorney, this is illegal, you can't do this. So at first, the lawyer was not arrested. But then they took all of the Jews from the little police precincts and put them together in the town square, and by the afternoon, those double not double-decker, but accordion with the combination in the middle buses showed up, and Augsburg was close enough to Dachau that they went by bus. And they had the blinds down, and you weren't supposed to look, but my father, 18 years old, looked out the window, and he could see that they were going to Dachau. And in the seat behind him was the son of Arthur Teutsch, but Arthur Teutsch was wounded in World War I and wasn't arrested. So his son, Erich Teutsch, was behind my father. Erich Teutsch's son is David Teutsch, who was in charge of the Reconstructionist movement, whose wife is Betsy Teutsch, who did the graphics for our prayer book and did the calligraphy for Yolanda and Nancy's wedding. So years ago, she's doing the invitations and she comes across Rick Landman. So that's how I was outed to that side of the Jewish family. So they ended up going to Dachau that night, by the time they got there. And it is like you saw in the black and white movies with the people being beaten and scared and the dogs and everything. And then they lined up everybody. Now, my father hung out with guys who were in the Hitler Youth. So my father knew all of the proper ways that you scream and yell and do all that stuff. And the older Jewish men didn't. And the Gestapo was sort of like beating and making fun of and ridiculing. If you didn't say, like in English, you had to say sir after he asked you something like, ja, Herr Oberführer, or something. So the other people, if they didn't say that, they got beaten until they learned to say that. So when they came to my dad, my father was sort of, he could figure it out. You know, he goes, ja, Herr Oberführer. And then they said, did you say goodbye to your mother? And then he goes, wonder what the answer is. If he says yes, or... So it didn't matter, because if he said yes, they would have said, good, because we're going to kill you now. He said, goodbye to your mother. And if he said no, they said, well, now we're punishing you, we're going to kill. So they said to my father, up against the wall to be shot. So my father goes up against the wall to be shot. And again, in typical my father, the way he tells the story, he says to me, I waited. 5 minutes went by. This is rude. In Germany, you do not do this. And I looked, and there's a man up there with a machine gun, and I said, what's the worst they can do? Shoot me? They're going to shoot me. So he starts walking back slowly, and it was a long line of people, and the Gestapo agent who was yelling at him was over there. So as he walks over to here, a tall man grabs him, pulls him behind, and puts him in the row behind him, and when this Gestapo went by, didn't say a word to my father. So that was the first night when he was there. And then they had him roll down and go to the... My grandfather was a big macha, and so was the rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov. So the first one to roll down was the little Henry Landman, and then next to him was Joseph Landman, and next to him was Rabbi Yaakov, whose son was the first rabbi at the Munich synagogue, Beth Shalom. And my father says, that's when I really freaked out, when the rabbi was crying. So up until that point, he was sort of able to hold it all together. So that was the first day in Dachau. The next day, or the day after, my father wasn't sure. He heard that they were saying another bus is coming from Augsburg. So they were all, couldn't physically see, but they were listening to what was happening. That's the day that Leopold Riese, the lawyer, walking off the bus, was screaming again, this is illegal, you can't do this. They killed him right walking off the bus. So they saw his body coming in. But he never physically saw that, but he heard that. That's why every year on Kristallnacht, I always say Kaddish for Leopold Riese. So that's the Dachau stories that I'll just say from that point in time. But now I'm going to flip up to 7th Avenue, right near where our new synagogue is going to be on 29th Street. My father worked at 134 West 29th Street as a furrier. And we're walking down the street at lunchtime, and my father says, Riki. And by the way, in the 60s, I did not know that he was in Dachau. I did not know what Kristallnacht was. Neither did my mother. My mother did not know that my father was in Dachau. So we're talking around 1966, 67 or so. So my father goes, hurry up, hurry up. So I run with him, and he taps this tall man on the shoulder. The man turns around, and my father goes, excuse me, I don't want to upset you, but were you in Dachau the day after Kristallnacht? And the man looks at my father and goes, how do you know? He goes, remember the little boy? He goes, is that you? So my father said, I always wanted to say thank you, but they wouldn't let him talk. And I'm sitting there, crying. Couldn't believe what's going on. They shook hands, never expressed what your name is, where your phone number, and they just left. And I'm sitting there, I mean, as I said, I still can visualize it. And I said to my father, you didn't even ask him his name. And he goes, I don't want to remember about that time. He doesn't want to remember about that time. Forget about it, let's go on. So again, this is how, growing up, I always would know about stuff, but not know about stuff. And this was the 50s and the 60s. So, all right, I'll go back now to Germany. So, Kristallnacht, the next day, the Gestapo comes and rings the doorbell again. My grandmother now opens the door. She doesn't know where her son is. She doesn't know where her husband is. The Gestapo goes, where's Joseph Landman? Grandmother goes, I thought you have him. So they go, no, we need Joseph Landman to sign the deed for the Jewish property over to the German government. This is all being Nazi-ified. So my grandmother goes, I haven't seen him since yesterday morning. Maybe he's in Dachau. You know, so sure enough, they find my grandfather in Dachau. So he's released right away. Only a few days was he in Dachau. So when he gets out, he has to sign over the property, but he's able to go to Stuttgart, the American consulate. And the first time he goes in, he says he's a Polish-born Jew living in Germany. So they give him, I think it's 1,545 was his quota number, and they said in 3 years, we'll call you up. So he was very depressed, and he was outside crying, whatever, and then he bumps into someone who's happy and all excited, I'm going to America. And he's going, how are you going to America? We went to school together, you know, and you're from the same area that I'm from. He says, what the hell did you tell them? He said, I'm a Polish Jew. You're not a Polish Jew, you're a Russian Jew. Let me look up, he says, that's not Polish, that's Russian. So they went back to the line, and the actual piece of paper is in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and all this stuff is on my website. And they crossed off in red pencil the 1,445 and wrote in 56A. The other man was 56, and they said, you can go to America, but America has to want you. So America had all these rules. You had to have like $5,000, which was a lot of money at that time, and affidavits and all this stuff. But my grandfather Joseph was able to get the stuff. So he was able to go to America. But on his way to America, you had to go to London. So he stops by London, and I don't know how he picked this lawyer. He picked a lawyer, and he said, here's money. Now you try to get Henry out of Dachau with a temporary transit visa to London, and then when America lets me bring my family in, Henry could come to America. So my father is then released from Dachau, because he has a temporary transit visa. So while he is home, my grandmother and 2 sisters were women. They didn't go to concentration camp, so they were still in the house in Augsburg. So my grandmother was rather depressed and frightened when the Gestapo man came for them to pack. So it's something called a lift. It's like a big crate that they put on top of a truck, and then when they get to the boat, they take the crate off and they put it on the boat. So my father had to pack the crate because my grandmother stayed in the room and closed the door. So that's the story that I tell at Passover on how do I have these sets of Haggadahs that my father and I continued to read in German up until last year as the tradition of keeping that this is the same child reading his Haggadah for his entire lifetime. Because when the Gestapo man, if you had a stamp collection, that's not leaving Germany. So my father realized that and just gave it to the Gestapo man. So he was there sitting, looking at all the stamps, and then my father would say, like, can I take this? And if it was like a gold candlestick or a silver candlestick, they'd say, no, that stays in Germany. And if he'd say, can I take the family set of 6 Haggadahs? Yeah, Germany's not going to need Haggadahs anymore. So those are the kinds of things that my father packed into that lift. And then that lift went to America. And that is why we have so many things and paperworks and photographs and trophies and certificates from the Sportsplatz, because that's what an 18-year-old kid puts in a lift to send to America. So then on April 15th, he leaves Germany, and he's able to get to England, and he lands in England. He is not an enemy alien yet. That comes in September. But he doesn't speak English. He has no money. He doesn't know what to do. He's 18 years old. So he decides, I'm going to go thank the lawyer who did this paperwork. So he walks across London, and he finds the lawyer, and he goes to the lawyer, and the lawyer's name was Charles Aukin, A-U-K-I-N, and says, but Aukin goes, I don't speak German, but my wife's parents speak Yiddish. Do you speak Yiddish? Now my father speaks Yiddish, again, because although 3 of his grandparents or 2 of his grandparents are German, those other 2, Sophie and Gershon, only spoke Yiddish. So my father spoke both Yiddish and German. So he says, thank you, I'll come for dinner for Shabbos for Friday night. It's free food. So my father spends money on buying flowers. It's also the German thing in him. And he goes and he brings the flowers and eats dinner at their house. And then at the end of the evening when dessert comes, the wife of the lawyer's parents, the ones who speak Yiddish, come for dessert. And they're talking, and my father takes out a photograph, a wallet size of the one that I have in there that I'll show you, and they look at this picture and they go, you said you're from Augsburg. My father goes, yeah. They go, no, these 2 Orthodox Jews in the front, that's Sophie and Gershon Landman. We stayed in their house.
Oh my goodness.
Years ago when we were coming before we could get to London. So my father's saying, like, I can't believe it. He goes, yes, we know your grandparents. So they turned to his son, the son-in-law, and said, you the lawyer, you take care of him, and you get him to America. So where my father couldn't get the equivalent of a green card, couldn't get a place to live, nothing, the next morning where he's staying in some flea, he said he had bed bugs. It was up in an attic, and it was like terrible. This big limousine comes with this big Jewish lawyer, and they brought him down to where it was, and where everyone else is waiting online for hours to get in. And I have it on my website and in my book, the exact name, Bloomsbury or something building. My father goes, I was there 2 days already. You can't get in. I've been there from like 5 in the morning. He says, because you went in the front door. He says, now you're with me. So they walked into the back door, and they walk in, and they go, I need him. What does he do? He was a furrier. Oh, we need furriers. So boom, boom, boom. Here is your paperwork. Here is your green card. And you have a job this afternoon to go to. So that man, Charles Aukin, was really helpful to my father. Now we'll go, I'm skipping a little bit. Well, okay. So then my father, on Thanksgiving Day, lands in New York City on the SS Harding, and lands in Manhattan and goes to Washington Heights and is reunited with his father, and by that time his mother and 2 sisters are there. So the Landman nuclear family is now together. Unfortunately,
what year is that?
November, Thanksgiving of 1939. Now, Gershon and Sophie will be deported and killed in Theresienstadt in 1943. Minna Wolf will die in Auschwitz. Gershon and Sophie's children, we don't know where they died. We don't know where specifically. And then all of the cousins and the only ones that got out was Joseph. And then he could take his wife and kids because he was Russian. And the quota, Stalin wasn't letting anyone out. and the quotas were so filled for all the other countries. So that's how I basically was alive. But then Daddy's living in Washington Heights. This is the time when Mommy is at Beth Hillel with Henry Kissinger. So just as a little aside, as a very little kid, I played with David and Elizabeth, his children. So you have to picture this going back before he's Secretary of State and everything. I'm a little kid and I'm going, well,
Mommy, the man on the telephone, he says he's Secretary of State or something like this. He's a very important person, but I think it sounds like David's father on the phone would like to speak to you.
so my mother, my father would say something, thank God I didn't take lessons. Kissinger actually took lessons to lose his accent. So my father goes, I saved so much money, I sound like a Heine, and so does he. But I was like a 10-year-old kid that really did a spot-on imitation of Henry Kissinger at that time. So my father then enlists, and his part goes down to basic training in Fort Wheeler in Georgia in 1943. And he writes letters back to his mother, and all of these email letters and everything are in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And he writes basically like, they don't really like me because I'm a Jew. They don't really like me because I'm a German. He's an enemy alien by this time for, we're at war. So he goes, the only people who are nice to me are the African-American people. But you can't go out to lunch with them, you can't do anything. He goes, it's sort of like Germany, what they're treating them is like what they treated us up until Kristallnacht. So my father then keeps on saying to them, I want to join the army, but I'm very good at skiing. Augsburg is right near Garmisch and the high mountains in southern Germany. So they said, oh, you want to be in the ski patrol? He goes, yes, this is what I want to be in the ski patrol. So they said, good, you're going to be in the ski patrol. But first you got to go to basic training down in Georgia. So then they go, okay, now you finish with basic training, we're sending you to North Africa.
Oh.
So he's in North Africa, and they torpedoed the ship that had his citizenship papers.
Oh.
So he wasn't a citizen for quite some time. He kept on saying like, where's my ski patrol? I want to go skiing, and when am I becoming a citizen? And they go, now you got to go to Iran. And then when he finished North Africa, then they went to Sicily. Then he landed in Anzio. Then he was through the Anzio beachhead breakout. Then he was through France. Then he was through across the Rhine. And then by Beschert, where does his area go to? Augsburg, Munich, and Dachau. So when he's back in Dachau, he remembers the day that he was released from Dachau. They said Dachau was like one street. It was like one little street. And they said to him as he left and he's walking, if you ever say anything of what happens, we will find you, we will find your family, and all this other type of stuff. Now he is with the American soldiers coming down that same street in the other direction. So he does explain that he doesn't want to go in there. Been there, done that. So they said fine. So he was with his Jeep, and this woman comes out, and she's screaming that she wants to stop him from the Jeep. And the inmates were beating up the soldiers, the